Hey guys, I wanted to get on here and share with you some scripture, share with you some things that the Lord's been teaching me. If you have been following my blog, you have seen some of these videos as I've been just studying through the book of Joshua. And so the last video I posted last week was about this first part of Joshua chapter 2. We talked about how Rahab, this woman who was involved in prostitution, again, most likely not by choice, was a conduit of God's provision and a recipient of God's grace. And just what a powerful story that is. We're going to look at Joshua chapter 2, verses 8 through 14. I am not going to read all of that. We're going to focus on one verse. But this is just the next part of the story of the book of Joshua. And this is a passage when Rahab goes to the spies that Joshua has sent into Jericho. And she is basically telling them, we are all terrified that y'all are here. And so I want to look at two verses. I said one verse, but we're going to look at two verses, verses 9 and 10. Say a couple words about that, and we'll go from there. It says that she came up to them. In verse 9 it says, said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. So here you have this woman, Rahab, who is not one of God's people, yet she has heard the stories of God's greatness and his power and provision on behalf of his people. And so just some things that we see in the whole section here, Joshua chapter 2, really enlightens us about these things. But the first thing we see is that God terrifies his enemies, that God is not someone to be trifled with. A lot of times in our understanding of the Bible, we focus on the fact that God is loving, and that is powerful and oh so true. But God is also mighty. He is majestic. He is magnificent. And sometimes that power comes out in righteous, just wrath against his enemies. So she, on behalf of God's enemies, is terrified of God. She says that the enemies of God melt before him. And I had to look at what this word meant. And many times when it shows up in the Old Testament, because you can see that phrase a lot, that our hearts or their hearts melted before God. And oftentimes, as is the case here in Joshua chapter 2, it's this idea that they are afraid, they are discouraged, that God has come to bring his righteous wrath upon them. But we also see here that God powerfully rescues his people. She is sharing, hey, this is what I've heard about what God has done for you. And she recounts some things that happened in the history, the story of God's people. How God dried up the water of the Red Sea so that they could escape Egypt. How they were able to defeat these two kings, Sihon and Og, which is interesting. And we see here, again, this reminder that God is at work for his people, that he is powerful. So that us, as followers of God, his power, his majesty, doesn't have to intimidate us or scare us, although I think there can be a healthy fear of God. Those things shouldn't scare us. Those things should help us to rejoice that he's on our side and that he rescues us. These two kings that she referenced here, they were destroyed by God. You think of these huge kingdoms that God laid waste to through his people. And this destruction of these two kings actually shows up in the book of Psalms several times. So the people of God actually sang songs about God's rescue of them. And here's what I want this to lead us to, this passage. Ultimately, I want us to have a healthy fear of God, a healthy fear that remembers that God is so powerful and strong and mighty, and that in comparison to him, I'm nothing. I am just dust. And that doesn't have to, this fear, what I mean by this fear is not terrified, scared that God's going to pour out his wrath on me, because that wrath has been poured out on his son, Jesus, on the cross. But what I do pray in my heart is that I would remember how big God is. We're in a season right now that is unprecedented, crazy, just wild. And yet we should remember who our God is. And it's beautiful to me that you have this woman who is not one of God's people, who had her heart enlightened to the reality that God is not only powerful, but he also provides for his people. And so that's my encouragement for you guys today out of the book of Joshua. Have a great weekend.